Thank you very much for coming to the 5th annual Doran Lecture. Thank you very much, Alan and Sue, for stepped out for a sec.
Oh, here we are.
Oh, there you are. Sorry. Okay. So thank you very much for coming to the 5th annual lecture. We're very pleased to have Professor Josh Goldstein here, Director of the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, and he's going to give a talk. First, we're going to have a few words by Avner de Shalit, and then Alan Doran is going to say a few words, and then I'll say a few more words about Josh.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I'll be very brief. I just want to say that it's becoming a tradition now. This is the 5th year, as guys just said, and I think it's a lovely tradition. And I would like to thank not only Alan and Sue, but the Doran family for this donation and for this initiative. The whole thing was initiated by the family, and we were very happy to embrace it and to embrace them. I should say actually that now Alan has become an even closer friend of the Hebrew University, because they also support the Glocal program, and is very enthusiastic about the Glocal program. To those of you who don't know, that's development studies, and I feel that I personally am very lucky to have met you and to know you, and I think it's a wonderful friendship. So I want to thank you. I want to thank the department, the two departments actually, economics and sociology and anthropology and demography, for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be here again. And of course, I would like to thank our lecturer for coming all this long way to visit us and to talk to us. So I'm looking forward to your lecture. Thank you. And Alan, could you please say a few words?
Sure. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm going to say very few words. I'm delighted to be here with my wife Sue. As Guy said, this is the fifth lecture, and it's great that we have yet another very distinguished international visitor to Israel. I took a little time to look up Max Planck in the Institute, and discovered a little bit about Max Planck, who lived to a grand old age and had a very interesting life. And in his early life, he befriended, or was a friend of, some of the great Jewish scientists in Vienna in the early days: Einstein, Lisa Meitner, Otto Hahn, and one or two others. And the Institute, which I didn't know about, is quite an amazing, powerful organization. And on the subject of demography, it's curious that my father, who was in whose name these lectures were given, was always concerned about there being too many people in the world. That was his big thing. And it now turns out that in some places at least the problem is too few. So with that, I shall leave the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. So Professor Goldstein's work is, as he'll be talking about, spans quite a range. He does a lot of mathematical demography, a lot of work in theory and demography, formal demography as we call it. He also manages to span quite a bit of areas within demography, sort of bringing in a social side that isn't always apparent in some demographic work. His background is actually, his first degree is in history from Yale, and then from Paris, and then from Berkeley. As director, they are doing some fascinating work on fertility. A lot of the work today is going to be talking about fertility and fertility decline. I think the Doran lectures, this is a very different lecture for the Doran lectures, but I think we've been moving around a lot, trying to expose people to a wide range of work related to population, resources, and development. A lot of what we know about population and development relations has come from our studying of historical cases, from studying Europe, for example. And in this case, I think we see that a lot of the most fundamental questions that we've been looking at are still unclear. So I think it's going to be a very interesting and useful talk for us. Thank you very much for coming to give it. I wanted to say that I think the talks are, one small measure of our talks is that they come out on we have videos up, and we haven't been totally effective about advertising this, but we do have a website with videos that have several thousand hits already. So the videos of our past lectures are being viewed, and hopefully this will continue as the list of lectures expands over the years. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So thank you for those kind words of introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Unless you want to sneak out, I urge you to come and sit closer to the screen so you can see the screen. I'll keep you. So Guy invited me, or asked me if I would be potentially available to come to give this lecture. And I said, what do I know about development? What do I know about population and environment? He said, well, it will be an interdisciplinary audience. And I said, well, that sounds fun. I'll try to do something for an interdisciplinary audience on births and the economy. I'm not an economist, I'm a demographer. And I'll try to bring things together from, I mean, here we have a mix of people from economics, from sociology, from anthropology, from history, and I'll try to bring this all together and see if we can make it work. So let's see if we can make it work. The talk today will be about the relationship between good times and lots of babies, or bad times and few babies. And I'll show some new results from the Great Recession that we're in now. I hope that we're emerging from it. And I'll take a long view of how this has been over long spans of history. So let me begin with some thanks. First of all, to the Doran family for endowing this lecture. I wish I had put fifth lecture, because I knew that I was in a great tradition, but the number 5 is very nice. I say the department, I should have said the departments, the many departments that are involved in this, for giving me this year's honor. And then I also want to thank and acknowledge my many collaborators. Here are a few of them that I talked to in the last weeks about this and who have written papers with. I have Yasmin Yone, worked with me on the new finding data for the new recession. Denise Karaman-Özal, who is a postdoc at Max Planck, and Michaela Kreinfeld, a colleague at Max Planck and professor at Rostock University. Okay, so let me begin with a story. It's a good way to begin. I think a personal story, and actually my motivation for looking into this topic came a little bit from personal interest. So my grandparents were in Virginia, the children of immigrants, and they were married. They met in the 20s and were married. I should know the exact month, because I think there's some debate about the conception of my father, but I think they were married about at the end of 1928. Okay? And very soon into 1929, my grandmother was pregnant with my father. My grandmother was the daughter of a very rich man. Apparently she was driven to school by a chauffeured limousine. And her father, the junk dealer, the millionaire junk dealer, proceeded to lose everything in the crash of, I guess it was October, Black Friday, 1929. And my grandmother, being then 7 months pregnant with my father, suddenly had another view of things. And my father was born in January. And it took another 8 years for my uncle to arrive. Okay? So my idea of the Great Recession, of the Great Depression, was that the stock market crashed, people lost everything, and they immediately reacted demographically, figuring out ways to not have children. The other part of the story was that my grandmother got pregnant very quickly. So they entered marriage not knowing much, and then they found ways to dramatically change their behavior. And in demography, we have a long history of studying the Great Depression. It's the time of the lowest birth rates in the United States and in many countries. It's a time when many countries had birth rates that were so low that there were worries about populations going extinct. And I was very sure that my own family's experience was the general rule. So, did the Great Depression drive births down? So we can ask this question to this room. And if I hadn't prefaced this by talking about surprising things, everyone would say, sure, the Great Depression drove births down. In fact, if we asked most students what happened to the Great Depression, they would say, sure, the Great Depression drove births down. But if we look at a picture, we see this is not at all the case. Okay? So this is the United States. And on the y-axis, I have a measure of the number of children. This is an annual measure. Pretend people live their whole lives in 1 year. It's what we call a period measure. And this is the United States. And what do we see? In the 20s, we see fertility going down. And in the 30s, we see fertility going down. And here I've just put a line at 1929. And we see nothing happens. Okay, well, we can, I don't know if we have any statisticians here, but we can torture this line and try to say something happened. I don't know. Maybe really nothing happened. If I didn't draw this line here and left out the dates, you wouldn't know where the Great Depression hit. Okay? So, yes, fertility was going down in the Great Depression, but it was also going down in the roaring 20s, very good times in the United States. Okay? And if we look in other countries, we see actually the United States is just like every place else. For some reason, France even saw a slight increase. But these are just wiggling lines. We don't want to make anything out of these little bumps. In Spain, fertility was going down in the 20s, went down in the 30s. In the US, in France, in Sweden, it's the same pattern everywhere. The Great Depression didn't do anything. Strange. Okay. Why is this? Today, there's a lot going on. Okay, here's a couple of countries. I've chosen the US. And a couple of countries in Europe where, so Lehman Brothers, October is a very bad month for world depressions and recessions. You know, Lehman Brothers in what I guess it's 2008, yeah, 2008 hit, and we see that some countries were affected dramatically, some countries were affected somewhat. Okay, and even places where fertility didn't change after the recession, you see what the trend was. So we have to keep in mind what the trend was. This is a little bit like the Great Recession, that's the Great Depression. The trend is going down, so you want to look at changes in the trend, not just changes in level. So even in the Czech Republic, there was arguably a big effect of the recession. And in the United States, where things hit a little bit earlier, fertility started falling a little bit earlier. Okay? So we have a situation where today births, the economy seems to matter quite a bit. A long time ago, it didn't seem to matter. What about in the big picture? Okay, so here's we have Mrs. Doran here, a historian. I promised her I would show her something from the 17th century, or maybe I even said 16th century. Okay, can people see this in the far away? Okay, so let's get a sense of what's happening here. The red line are births, baptisms. The green line are burials. Okay, and the black lines are marriage, changing the scale a little bit. This is from the classic work of Tony Wrigley. Okay, so this is a village in England. Village? Town? I don't know. It's called village. Okay. And I just want to point out this one episode here. Okay, so what happened? Things got really, really bad. Okay? There was a huge, presumably some failed harvests here, presumably some kind of epidemic here. And when times got bad, marriages went down. Okay? And births went down some. And you see that right afterwards, when times got good again, people got married again, and births rose. So in history, okay, this is the Malthusian world that I'll talk more about, there was a very strong relationship between good times and bad times. And you can see this in the weather, you can see it in grain prices, you can see it by looking at the relationship between taking mortality as a measure of bad times, the relationship between mortality and fertility. Okay? So.
Baptism is not really birth?
Sorry?
Is it possible that baptism
Yes?
is not really birth? It's a lot of very young children.
This is a very studied topic, and the question you have asked has launched 1,000 papers about whether baptisms are a good measure of births. And in fact, there are lots of very... Yeah, this picture is chosen because we think the data is quite good, but it is there are. I don't know if there are another 1,000 papers to write on this topic, but I think the answer in general is that no, not everything is reported, and there are ways to try to detect whether baptisms are delayed through the days that people live. Because there's a certain pattern of mortality in terms of your mortality is highest a few days, hours after birth, goes down in a very specific pattern. And so by looking at that pattern, you can infer whether people are missing. But we don't see any of that here. I don't want you to question any of these stylized facts. We can debate them, of course, but I think you'll have more questions about my explanation than about the stylized facts. I think I'm actually going to say a word about what I want you to do in a minute. Okay, so what are our puzzles? Our puzzles are, when does the economy matter? We already saw that more or less. Why not always? Okay, what's going on with the Great Depression? We'll see that in the 1970s it was also not such a clear relationship. And then what are the lessons of the relationship between the economy and people's I'll say decision to have children, making a bold statement that people are deciding to have children. What does it tell us about individual choice or social change or about fertility? And maybe it tells us something about fertility in the future. Okay, so these are the things I'll try to answer for you. The structure of the talk will be, I'll go through these 3 cases I went through very quickly right now and try to explain to you how we think the world worked in Malthusian times, say during the Great Depression and today. And then I'll try to take explanations from economics, sociology, and demography, and I'll try to carry the torch of demography and show how demography will help us solve some of the puzzles that are not answered by economics and sociology. Okay, and here's my warning. I'm going to paint broad strokes. There are many experts in the room on each of these subtopics, and you're welcome to challenge my broad strokes, but you're also welcome to challenge how I put them together. Okay, so, and you should feel free to interrupt, particularly if I forgot to explain something, like what the graph is a picture of. Okay. So let's begin and go through our kind of the descriptive part of this talk, how the economy has mattered, whether it mattered, that sort of thing. Okay, so I'll show this slide 3 or 4 times, and the red just means that we're going to start with the Malthusian world. Okay, so here we have the Reverend Malthus. This is, I don't know when this picture was painted. It's the only picture you see of him. He's actually smiling a little bit, but any of you who have read Malthus know that he is a severe person, and that he is a preacher, but his book is not just a sermon. It's a very impressive piece of work, and he is calling for moral restraint. So what does he mean by moral restraint? Okay, well, he means no sex, okay, but he means no marriage. Okay, so populations were able to control themselves in some ways by changing marriage patterns. Okay, we saw that already in the first picture. And so in the Malthusian world, what happens is when times are good, people can get married, and when times are bad, there are obstacles put before marriage, and they have to wait. And because of that, it changes the timing of births, and also because people are not really practicing fertility control within marriage, if you get married later, you end up having fewer children, and so it changes the rate of population growth. Okay, so in his first book, Malthus was a theorist and a sermon writer in some sense. But in the second edition, which I'll show you a quote now, he travels around the world, his world, mostly Europe, and reports on the marriage practices in every country. Okay, and it's very interesting. And I'm not sure, actually, if anthropologists read him, but he should be read for anthropologists, because he goes around, he does this comparative, it's like reading Le Play or something, but much earlier, and he gives his reports on the state of the way population is controlled in different places. Also in ancient Rome, he visits ancient Rome somehow, and ancient Greece, and talks about that. Okay, so here's an example from his own country. In his own country, of course, he sees great diversity in classes, and so here's the example of most people. These are the sons of tradesmen and farmers, so the vast majority of the English, and they are exhorted not to marry and generally find it necessary to comply with this advice. What I want you to take from this quote is that the whole society is pressuring people on whether it's okay to get married or not, and until they're settled in some business or farm which may enable them to support a family. And he goes on and talks about in Denmark, where the priest won't approve you unless you can show you have sufficient resources, or he doesn't talk about Germany, but it's a famous case in Germany that these kind of village councils decided who was allowed to get married and who wasn't. So the whole village stopped you from moving forward with your, helped you with your moral restraint when they thought it advisable. Okay? Okay, so Malthus was also an empiricist, not just an ethnographer going around, but he also was a quantitative thinker. And so now I show you one of his original tables. Can people see this a little bit? Okay, this is Malthus, the statistician. It says on the checks of population in Sweden, that's just from the top of the page, which I put on the slide. And these are the numbers he reports. These are annual numbers of marriages. This is just like Tony Wrigley showed. Okay. Births, deaths, and he has 4 consecutive years here, 1757 to 1760, and in his biblical language, he has his barren years. Okay, these are not 7 barren years, these are 2 barren years, followed by not 7 abundant years, but 2 abundant years, and we see what happens. During the barren years, there are very few marriages, 18,000, 19,000, and then suddenly, when the good times come, people can get married. The births react in the same way, a little less dramatically, because it takes time to have babies. Okay. And go from 81,000, 83,000, 85,000, 90,000. We probably want to detrend this to get a sense of the real magnitude. And the deaths go way down, okay, even though the population is growing during these good years. Okay? So he gathered a lot of evidence like this and showed that there was a very close connection. What's remarkable, I think, and it's a little bit hard to believe, is that things were so rapid. That the response would be so dramatic, so quick. I mean, remember, when we thought about the Great Recession, we saw that picture. It probably passed through all of your minds. Well, maybe people didn't react immediately. Maybe it took them a few years. Right? That's in the modern world. Well, apparently, in the past, people reacted very quickly. In fact, they react so quickly in some of these tables that you think they're slightly cherry-picked. It's too good to be true. It proves his point very well. But that's why I'm picking it, because I want to show you the stylized world of the past. Okay, so how did the ancient world work, at least in Northwest Europe? There were very strong controls on marriage, and this meant there was a very tight relationship between the state of the economy and birth rates. Okay, and I'll have one more comment. This was all through social pressure, and of course a great amount of demographic research and interest has gone into the notion of auto-regulation of a population. Somehow this population manages to stay roughly constant size for a very long time because of this canceling out effect. When times are bad, births go down. When times are good, births go up. And it manages to kind of auto-regulate itself. And this is achieved as if some kind of social planner were designing the system. Okay? And it's a great puzzle. How could such a system evolve? Why would societies do, I've talked about populations doing this and doing that, but we all know it's people doing this and doing that. So it's an open question how such a society involved. In the present day, of course, we're all acting, at least we think we're acting individually, and yet we meet the same kind of outcome. So it's a good example in economics of the kind of society achieving the same thing as individuals do in an uncoordinated way, kind of invisible manner. Okay. So now let's look at the modern world. Here I just want to illustrate with some new results on what's happening as a result of the Great Recession. This is the United States. This is a graph I did a year or two ago, and we should look at 2009, but already in 2008 we could see, sorry, this is 2009, we should look at 2010 to make sure this is still happening. But these are states. You don't have to be able to read them particularly. They're just the initials. And here I have the unemployment increase. This is in pure percentage points, 1%, 2%, from just this very short time, 2007 to 2008. Okay. And you see that the states where there's bigger increase in unemployment, the fertility goes down more. Here is the ratio. Here's what it was in 2009. Sorry, 2008. It was on average, and this is 2009. So the number smaller than 1 means fertility has gone down. Okay. So this is the way. I think a better way to see this is to look at a map of the United States, and here the dark colors, the oranges and reds are smaller birth rates, so bigger declines in birth rates, and here is the bigger change in unemployment. We see it's very much correlated to where the housing prices went way down. The prices went way, way down in these states, and also in the South. So, and then we have Michigan and the automobile industry and things like that. Okay, so we have essentially the same pattern, and we can see it also at smaller geographic levels. Okay. So what about Europe? Okay, in Europe, things are we can do the same kind of analysis. Here I've plotted things in a slightly different way. I haven't done it relative to 1. I've done it, this is now percentage or fractional change. Okay. And here I don't have the percentage points of unemployment because the unemployment rates are very different. I've just done the ratio of unemployment in 2010 to that of 2008. So the neutral place is 1. So in Germany, there was really no recession, so it's close to 1. There was also no change at all in birth rates. Okay? In Estonia, unemployment tripled, and the birth rate went down by about 0.15 children. Okay? And I haven't even graphed the country I showed before, Latvia, which is down here. It's off the map. Okay? And again, we see there's not a perfect relationship, but there's a clear relationship that with the countries being harder hit, having fertility changing more, and the countries that are not hit much at all, there not being any change in fertility. Furthermore, as we always do when we look at European countries, we ask, well, what about institutions? So in America, it's a little hard to say, does Florida have different institutions than Texas, or different institutions than Massachusetts? Well, maybe a little bit, but in Europe, we have kind of these welfare state typologies. And so we can kind of ask, well, what do the countries above that have less impact than expected have in common, and what do the countries below have in common? And we can see this corresponds broadly to kind of our welfare state typology. The countries with strong welfare regimes seem to cushion the impact of the recession. Even though unemployment goes up a lot, the effect on fertility is less than expected, and in places that are not don't provide much social protection, there's a big impact, okay? Bigger than expected. Okay? So we see that institutions do matter in the present world in this kind of picture, but that the general picture is fairly clear. Places where the recession hits harder, there's more decline in birth rates. Okay, so we have the ancient past and the present that look essentially the same. Oh, there's one more thing I wanted to say about the present. What kind of fertility change is happening? Well, the recession is hitting the young hard, and it's also reducing birth rates by the young the most, because the young people can afford to change their behavior. They have plenty of time. Their clock is ticking, but if I'm 22 years old and things are not as good as I was expected, I put off having a birth. Okay? However, if I'm 39 years old, I don't put off having a birth. Okay? And in fact, we see that it's the young people who, both probably because they're harder hit by the recession, but also because they have lots of time, okay, that are having many fewer births, whereas the older people their birth rates are trending upwards just as they were before the recession. And this is, there's a tiny word written down here just to remind me to say, this is the pattern, the signature of fertility postponement. Okay, so remember this picture.
Why does it change?
The reason it goes up is because, it's a good question, the reason it goes up is because these people have been postponing births for a long time in the past, 20 years. So when they were 25, they were postponing births. When they were 30, they were postponing births. And now they've run out of time. And if we plot the birth rate of 37-year-olds, it looks like this. So it's still going up. Sorry, think of time here. And I'll plot the 37-year-olds. It's been going up very strongly until the recession hits. And when the recession hits, it continues going up, but slightly less.
It's changed from by age of the same cohort? Going from 37 to 38? Or 39?
No, this is 30. This is the 2 years. This is 2010 and 2008. How much birth rate?
Age here,
Yeah.
33. Is this 33, and then a group younger 2 years later, those who were 31?
No, it's 33 years old in 28 and 2008 and 33 years old in 2010.
Okay, so it's the same
Yeah.
people.
No, these are different people. Different people.
Exactly the same
Yeah.
age.
If I drew a curve,
So why does it go up then? It's not clear.
Because
why should people that are 39-year-old
have more babies in 2010 than in 2008?
Yeah.
Good question. I will answer it at the end. Is that okay?
Okay.
It's a good question.
That's the
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, it's a good question. Okay. Okay. So now we're done with our description of the present world, and now I see people want to get to explanations, so we'll go quickly through the Great Depression.
We're happy to see that.
This is the picture we saw earlier, and I just want to show you really, I tortured this data. I should say, Jan van Bavel wrote a great paper a few years ago, I'll give you the citation at the end, where he asserted that the Depression had no effect. And I didn't believe him. Okay, I read the paper, I still didn't believe him. Okay, and so then I tortured the data. I said there must be some effect. So let me just show you one attempt at torturing the data. This is hard to see. This is now every birth order. So this is the US. Here's the change that we just saw for all the births combined. Here's birth 1, first births. Here's births 2, which you can't see. They're green. Here's birth 3. You don't have to see this slide. There's nothing happening. You can look at age. You can look at parity. You can look at just blacks. You can look at just whites. Nothing is happening. They're all straight lines. It's the most boring graph in the world. And that's not to say nothing's happening. The lines are still going down, but they're just continuing on trend. Okay.
Except for the first person, which is going up a little.
Yeah, I don't think we want to make too much about this. I mean, we have somebody from the Statistical Bureau here. What happened in 1930? What happened in 1930 in the U.S.? What's important for statisticians? There was a census. We adjusted all denominators. Who knows whether you can really take the
Marriages didn't go down?
Good question. We can talk about that in discussion. Okay. Okay. So let's rephrase our puzzle. It's the same question we had earlier. The economy mattered long ago. Then it didn't. The Great Recession. Now it does. Why? Okay. We have economists, sociologists. I wish I would have put anthropology in here, but you all can give me the anthropological answer to this question during our discussion. Okay. So how does economics think about this? Okay. So I'll parody economics, I'll parody sociology, and I'll also parody demography, don't worry. Okay. We basically have two explanations. Okay, one is the kind of income effects. This is the story we got from Malthus. Good times, people can afford more children. Bad times, they can afford fewer children. They change their behavior. Okay, then we have the new home economics, which is a little hard to say today because this is already 50 years old. Okay. This is Gary Becker and many followers. And here the story is, wait a second, having children when times are really good, okay, and I can earn lots of money, do I really want to have a child? Well, no, maybe I want to wait a little because things are so good, I should wait or put off having a child. Maybe the things I'd rather do than have children. And if you raise wages enough, people will choose to do other things than to have children, okay, particularly women. Okay? This is probably a little bit what happened in East Germany after the wall came down. Okay, times were bad, unemployment went up. But on the other hand, any young person, the last thing they wanted to do, faced with all this change and opportunity, was to have a little kid around. Right? They wanted to wait and see how things were going to happen. That's an example of opportunity costs. Okay, so this is a wonderful theory because since they predict opposite effects, you can never be wrong. Okay, this is not a predictive theory. This is just this is storytelling. When things go down, when things go down in bad times, it's an income effect. When things go down in good times, it's an opportunity cost. Okay, and maybe that's what happened in the 20s. Maybe it was opportunity costs. In the 30s, it was income. But why is it a straight line? Why do we see nothing? That's why I'm skeptical. Okay. Now, furthermore, if you predict that one dominates the other, you can be wrong. You can be wrong. So now I'm going to turn to, I don't know if this is the most cited paper, but there's some people who made a very brave prediction. And of course, They were wrong. Okay. So let's look at a grand prediction. This is from The Emergence of Countercyclical U.S. Fertility, which is a paper that argues that the opportunity costs are key to understanding swings in fertility, published in the American Economic Review, cited, it's hard to believe it's only cited 450 times, cited always. Is it cited always when one talks about the economy and fertility? I don't know. If you're talking about contemporary swings, it's cited always because they claim to have found empirical evidence that things go the other way. In good times, fertility goes down. In bad times, fertility goes up. That's what they mean by counter-cyclical. Goes against the business cycle. Okay, so.
What kind of citation? That's Google or Web of Science?
Oh, these technical questions. I'm painting broad strokes here. Broad strokes. Okay, yeah. Okay. The baby boom, they argue, okay, is consistent with the income effects hypothesis, but the decline that they're looking at, remember this is 1979, okay, is due to increase in female work and income provided by economic growth. Okay, so that's nothing that new, but then they claim to find empirical evidence of this, which is not so easy, and then they make the bold statement that our results indicate that future fertility movements can be expected to move counter-cyclically. Okay. The problem with prediction, of course, that you can be wrong. Okay, prediction is dangerous. So remember the relationship here. High unemployment, those are bad times, leads to high fertility. Remember, things go backwards. Okay? So here's a graph which you probably can't read. This is fertility up here and unemployment here. So as unemployment goes up, fertility goes down. No, that's wrong. That's not counter-cyclical. That's pro-cyclical. Okay? And as unemployment goes down, fertility goes up. Wrong. These are income effects. This is exactly what Malthus would predict. This is exactly what we're seeing today with the recessions. When times are bad, people have fewer kids. When times are good, people have more kids. This graph conveniently starts right here, 79. You know, they were not that wrong for the 70s, actually, but they've been wrong ever since they made a prediction. Okay? So I will, of course, conclude the talk with a prediction so you know what's going to happen in the future. Okay, so I can be wrong too. Okay. In fact, what happened if you kind of run panel regressions, and these are on a bunch of OECD countries. In fact, there's a negative effect in this. This is the 75 period. I think it's not shown here, of about 4%. This is for an increase of 1%. Unemployment, and that about doubles over this time period. It goes to about 8%. Now, why would it double? Well, what's happening over this time? Women are working more and more, and instead of things being counter-cyclical, as Butts and Ward predicted, when times got bad, women didn't remove themselves from the labor market. They stayed in the labor market because things ratcheted. So for the sociologists and anthropologists here, you can, I'm sure, have a good explanation for why things don't go backwards. Once people get used to two incomes and working and the lifestyle, they can't go backwards, or they avoid going backwards. And in fact, we get about a doubling of the effect. And so I'm calling this the double income effect, but it's doubling in two senses of the word. It's doubling of the effect, and it's also about double incomes, men and women both working. Okay? And I think we could all, in retrospect, we can all understand why Butts and Ward were wrong. It's because women do not go, starting in the 80s and 90s, they do not go in and out of the labor force. They begin having careers. They stay in the labor force. And people sustain their lifestyles through having double incomes. And during bad times, both people are hit. Okay. So this was not a problem with economic theory. This was just a problem with one particular paper, which may have been cited 450 times or maybe somewhat less. But we have the other problem, which I already alluded to, which is that this theory is fine for today. It's fine for the past, but it doesn't really help us explain what happened during the Great Recession. It's certainly not impossible that we had these income effects and then it switched to substitution effects, but it's a little bit, you have to twist yourself in a pretzel to get a straight line. Okay, so I'm done beating up on the economists. Now let's talk about the sociologists. Okay. So the cliche is that economics is about choice, or how people choose, and sociology is about how people don't have a choice. Well, that's good, because what we're seeing is that what people are, apparently people's realms of choice are changing over time. They certainly changed from Malthus to today, and maybe they changed in between. Okay, so that's what I say here. Sociology is also about how the arena of choice, or what is a choosable thing, changes over time. Okay, and here's I don't know if this is a parody, but here's a simplification, or one way to think about the social change that's occurred. We've gone from a rule-based situation of Malthus's time to what I'll describe briefly as a kind of a role-based world, where you're in a role but you're not required by society, but rather your normative pressures into your role and your expectations forms your behavior, to a modern world of individualism. And you know, who uses the words rules, roles, and individualism? I am. But we see this argument, I think, echoes with anybody who's read the sociological classics and reads other things. So, for example, Durkheim has the transformation from what he calls mechanical solidarity to organic solidarity. I don't want to explain what these things are. They're just keywords for those of you who know. And this would be kind of going from rules to roles, for example. Okay. So let me give some examples of the rules way of thinking. We saw already the quote from Malthus about how people were exhorted and they weren't allowed to do things. Here's Edward Shorter, the famous historian and sociologist of the family, talking about sexuality, which is, after all, what we're talking about here. We're talking about producing babies, so it's not a completely unrelated topic, but it's not exactly fertility. But sexuality, he's saying, in traditional society may be thought of as a great iceberg, frozen by the command of custom, by the need of the surrounding community for stability at the cost of individuality. And then he goes on to talk about how this iceberg melts. So that's the metaphor to have in mind. So what is it? Once it melts, it does melt. We'll see a little bit of evidence for it melting. What is replaced? So it's getting late, okay? And I'm now going to show you just a picture to give you a sense of roles. Okay, so here is Norman Rockwell, and here are these three people, and they are behaving in a very certain way. They're dressed in a certain way. They have their roles in their family, and this is the kind of society that we have certainly during much of the 20th century, where it's not that people are forbidden to marry or forbidden to work or forbidden to stay at home and take care of the kids, but each person has their role, and they stay in their role, okay? And we can also think of these roles as kind of scripts. People have a script, they think of their life a certain way, and then they follow the script of their life, and they tend to follow the script unless they're forced to change it, which is a painful personal identity type of thing, okay? So this is what we want to think about in the Great Depression, and maybe onwards until sometime in the recent past, okay? And sometime in the recent past, we had the individualism, or what life course sociologists like to call it, the destandardization of the life course, and life becomes less predictable, less collectively determined, that's the melting of the iceberg, less stable, this is for all of you interested in, say, globalization, things like this, we don't know what's going to happen, and more individualized. So now people can choose. They are really free to choose because all of the restraints and constraints of the iceberg have now melted, and also our roles are less rigid, and we can really choose to do what we want. So what's the role I have in mind here? The role, I think, that would probably make a lot of sense would be that of when people should have children, what a woman is when, if she has children or doesn't have children, this sort of thing. Okay. So what's the problem here? Well, as I hope the sociologists in the room are thinking to themselves, well, this is not sociology. In fact, sociologists spend just as much time debunking this kind of story as they do building it. And we're not more free and individualistic today. After all, anybody who can take a step back can see that it's just an illusion of the present. We're constrained by culture and roles and society, and we're just in a new iceberg, but we don't recognize we're in an iceberg. Okay? In the past, we can see the iceberg. Today, we can't. So that might be true. And there's a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that people are really not behaving in any more individualistic ways today than they were in the past. And then the other puzzle, okay, fine, the iceberg goes from being a massive block to something that's thawed. Well, why didn't births go down in the Great Depression? Right? I mean, why would in-betweenness give you nothing? You'd have some of the iceberg, you'd have maybe some individuality. Why would this all cancel out to give us nothing in the Great Depression? Okay. To the rescue. Demographic thinking. Okay. I won't say demographic theory, I think, because demography is famous for being theoryless, but I'll have demographic thinking. Okay. So now I get to talk about, okay. So Here is our grand theory, our demographic transition. Okay, and I've just copied a picture from not even Wikipedia. There's hundreds of pictures available if you want to make a talk on the demographic transition. I chose this one for a very specific reason because these guys got it right. Okay, you have the bouncing around of fertility rates in the past, and you have the bouncing around of fertility rates today. That's exactly this responsiveness, and you have nothing happening in the middle. Okay, so this picture, what does it show? It shows birth rates. It shows death rates. Death rates fall before birth rates. There's some lag here, and then you have population growth. Okay, but we'll ignore the population growth line. We'll ignore the mortality line, and we'll just look at the fertility line, the red line. Okay, so what was causing these bumps? Well, what was causing these bumps, if we take Malthus at his word, was not that people were controlling fertility within marriage, but rather they were controlling when they were going in and out of marriage. Okay, what's causing these bumps? Okay, well, presumably everything. People postpone having their first kid, maybe not their marriage or their partnership, but they postpone having their first kid, and they also stop. They say 1 is enough, 2 is enough, 3 is enough. Okay, so there's both. There's a lot of control of fertility within marriage today, and there's a lot of timing type of behavior. And in the middle, all this is what demographers call the first demographic transition. And this is where people started controlling the fertility within marriage. Okay? They started, once they were married, having fewer kids. Okay? And I think, Barbara, this is probably what your dissertation was about, right? How we can measure the controlling of fertility in marriage. Okay. So let me talk about a little bit the way demographers tend to think about these things. I'm going to talk about it not in terms of transitions, but in terms of revolutions and revolutions of thinking, because this is also thought to be a sociological revolution. People, particularly the first demographic transition, didn't really involve any new technologies. It didn't involve the pill. It didn't involve the invention of any contraceptive technology. It involved people applying an idea and thinking that it was acceptable to do so. So the first transition is through stopping. And in the famous words of Ansley Cole, Princeton demographer, economist, who often talked very much in sociological terms, he says, well, what happens is that fertility enters the calculus of conscious choice. Okay? So before, in Malthusian times, people were not thinking about how many children they were going to have, supposedly, and then they started thinking about it in a specific target. Okay? And the result was big declines in marital fertility. Okay? And the second revolution, which is quite modern, I think we can probably date it to the early 70s, okay, is a revolution of timing, and this is where it begins to be fine to wait to have children, and it's perfectly socially acceptable. I don't have any wonderful CCC way of saying this, calculus of conscious choice, but timing becomes, I can't think of any T's, but okay, something of timing. It's acceptable for couples to stay childless until just the right moment, and I'm sure we all have this idea, when is the right time to have children, and you're allowed to think this way. Okay? So what happened in the Depression? So one explanation is that people just continued to follow their scripts, and then when people follow their scripts, we don't see much. Okay, so one demographic answer is that people did not change the timing of the birth. There wasn't really a mechanism to change the timing of the birth. If you were married and you were childless, you went on and had your first child. If you were planning to have 2, you went on and had your second child. And the big time trend is coming from more and more people aiming for fewer families. And if you read ethnographies, there's a lot of people who do interviews of older people, particularly older women, about sexuality. It's a great pastime of social historians and ethnographers. You hear the story, well, I wanted a smaller family. Well, how did you achieve a smaller family? Well, at a certain point, then they explain the wonderful details. Okay? But this didn't happen at the beginning of the marriage. It happened after they had some children. And if we just think about this from a formal point of view, the shocks that we're seeing come from changes in flows. Okay, so babies being born. And the way you get changes here is through changes in stocks. You have to have a certain number of people reaching their target, which is a very slow, gradual thing. Okay? So let me just give you a little more detail of how this works, looking at the same age map. So this is the same picture I showed earlier. These are comparing birth rates at the same age at different points in time. Okay, above the line means it's going up. below the line means it's going down. Okay? So here is what we think of as the stopping revolution. Okay? So the stopping revolution is that at older ages we have much bigger declines than at younger ages. And we see the kind of thawing of the iceberg. In fact, what happened at the same time that this was all happening, the restraints, the social constraints on getting married went away. So the average age of marriage was going down during this demographic transition. There were loosening of these constraints. And that's why the birth rates are going up at younger ages. So this is the pattern we saw. I don't have data before this, but we could see this similar pattern if we went back probably 50 years or so. And then during the boom of the 20s, this is again in the US, sorry, we see kind of reduction at all ages, but especially at the higher ages. So there's fertility reduction at all. And the older you get, this is now when people are having more children, they're saying, okay, I'm going to stop more. And this is what Barbara did her dissertation on, this kind of evidence, but in a much more elegant way. And we see essentially the same pattern during the recession. Okay, it looks a little bit different. There's more stopping behavior, so that's consistent with the theory. And there's actually very little change in the births at young ages, which is very surprising. I would have thought there would be a big change at the young ages because people would change their patterns at early ages. But this is just now the stopping pattern. Now remember, this is just the opposite of our postponement pattern, which looks the other way. Okay, and you don't see any evidence of postponement here. In fact, the mean age of birth is going down because births are going down higher at older ages than at younger ages. Okay? So, in fact, the same is true for developing countries today. You see this kind of situation where during good times fertility goes down. This is an overstatement. And then when the times suddenly get bad, it continues to go down. People kind of switch modes. And that's because they're aiming for smaller family sizes, and people use every kind of excuse to translate that into reality. Okay. So let's review what we've done, and then I'll come to an end. Guys, you've given me 4 minutes, so I'll finish in 4 minutes. Okay. So we have the Malthusian past. The effect of a shock is negative. People have fewer births. The mechanism is starting, so people change the time when they start having children. The economists would call this an income effect, and the social mechanism, I'll call it the social control of marriage. Okay. In the middle, we get something where I've done here a minus and a plus. Okay, so something like 0. It's hard to see what was happening. We still have stopping. We have income effects later, say as we move towards the 70s, we have pretty clear, 60s and 70s, we have pretty clear substitution effects. And we get less marriage control, that's the increase at the very young ages, and individual freedom to limit family size. And the net result is complicated and unclear. Okay? In the recession, we got pretty much no effect. In the 60s and 70s, arguably, there's a little bit more substitution effects. And in the 50s and 60s, a little more income effects. But it's not really very clear. And then today, here I've done 2 minus signs because it's very clear that starting and stopping are in place, and they're both making the effect of the economy strong. This is pretty much a clear income effect. There's almost no substitution. Women are not changing their labor force participation much. And we have now not just individual freedom to limit family size, we also have individual freedom to wait. So of course there's the grandparents saying, or the want-to-be grandparents saying, when are you going to have children? But in terms of people's peers and everything like that, they can wait. There's no social pressure. There's nothing wrong with a couple that doesn't have children, at least for some extended period of time. Whereas that was not the case in, say, the Great Depression years. Okay, so there's a huge debate in economics, in demography, about culture versus economics, and this, I'm not the first one to say this is the wrong debate, but now I'm saying one way to understand this is about what matters, and when, and why, and that's how we can bring in cultural perspectives, economic perspectives. It's not that somebody wins all the time. One of my colleagues said, I read that article about the Great Depression, so I don't think the Great Recession is going to have any effect. And that's clearly the wrong way to think about this. It's not that there's one effect of economics on fertility. It changes depending on historical time. And we even saw the little difference in Europe between the welfare states. So it definitely depends on context. Interestingly, the social control of the past, this is kind of, I'll call him Malthus. This is the perfect social planner. And the invisible hand of the present, that is people acting on their own, both lead to the same outcome. And during transitions, I would predict the demographic tide towards smaller families is going to overwhelm the occasional gusts of the economic wind. And if we had good data, believe me, I tried to get annual data for the recession and things for developing countries, but of course, in the developing countries, you don't have good annual data because they don't have particularly reliable statistical systems, and so one has to use surveys, and then you get 5-year averages, 10-year averages, things like that. Okay. Now I can be wrong. My conclusion for the future, I told you I'd talk about the future. I predict pro-cyclical fertility. I don't think the two-couple earner family is going to become a one-earner family again, women withdrawing from the workforce, things like that. I think we'll continue to have pro-cyclical fertility. I think we'll have a quick recovery of births after the recession. And I think in countries still in transition, all roads will still lead to fertility decline. Now, clearly, I'll be a little bit wrong here. There'll be exceptions, but this is the broad strokes. Okay, now, before I end, we still have a puzzle. I started things with a personal story. So what was going on with my uncle and my grandparents? Why don't they fit my theory? Okay, well, the first lesson is, you don't start from a personal story and tell the whole, this is the fun of doing social science. You get to take anecdote and see, is it true, is it not? Sometimes it is, which then you think, oh, I don't need social science, but sometimes it's not, and we do need social science. But actually, there is a truth hidden inside this. When I read a little bit about the Jews and family planning in the 20s and 30s and fertility control, and we see, in fact, that my uncle was not atypical. I should say my grandmother was not atypical. The American Jews in the in the 20s and 30s were early and I'm calling them enthusiastic users of contraception. When you read these accounts, you kind of see they're very into rational planning of their families, and they use both starting and stopping, and they were in some sense in the Great Depression they were behaving like these aggregate populations are behaving today in the Great Recession. And coincidentally, Jews are often pointed to as forerunners for fertility transitions. There's famous work on Jewish communities in Italy, say in the 16th century, showing that there was a lot of fertility control, a lot of stopping behavior that arguably was 2 or 3 centuries ahead of its time. Okay? So I was not completely wrong. Probably my own family is typical of a segment of American society, but probably the segment really quite ahead of its time, in this case the Jews. Okay, so if you want to read more, I'm just putting these up so that I'll give you the slides if you want to read more about all these things. This paper was inspired by Jan's paper showing, which I didn't believe. I have a paper all about the importance of timing in determining ups and downs in recent fertility. There's a wonderful paper by one of my colleagues at Max Planck, Mikko Mieskola and his co-authors, about how richer countries are having more kids today. There's a wonderful review paper all about kind of doing what I just did here, but without any kind of synthesis, I would say. Well, they synthesize it also, but reviewing many, many papers and empirical research on different recessions and different measurements of the effect of economics. And then there's, for the sociologists and anthropologists here, I would highly encourage the new book by Jennifer Johnson-Hanks and colleagues, Understanding Family Change and Variation. And there they really go into this idea of scripts and the way people's scripts are what's determining what they're doing. So it's a completely different perspective. Okay, so on that end, I would say don't believe your family story, but then maybe in the end do a little bit. Okay? And I don't see any big change, long-term change as a result of this recession, even though we see a big short-term change. So thank you, and I'm delighted to take questions. My often mistaken colleague from Princeton, we have the same first name and the same last initial, and we used to get each other's email. Josh.
I found this to be just eye-opening and very interesting, so thank you. So one of the takeaways is let's not overgeneralize mechanisms, for example. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if I would have wanted you to see you decompose the population a little bit. I wouldn't want to make generalizations about things that are driving, say, farmers versus city dwellers, the chronically poor versus the upwardly mobile. I mean, one could think of a variety of different ranges and populations that are going to respond differently to these different trends. Obviously, we do get some gross trends that we can look at, but I wonder what your thoughts are on, sort of this issue of, well, there are some people who don't seem to be responsive at all to their own poverty, for example, in terms of childbearing, or
So what I show you are kind of average effects, net effects. Different people are reacting in different ways, and what we see in the current recession is that on average, people are acting in a way to have fewer births, and that doesn't mean that everybody is doing that. And in fact, there's probably quite a bit of variation in the population, and people have looked at this. One of the things, particularly in the context of social policy and economic opportunity. So people, for example, who in places where there are strong allowances for having babies, then a great time to have a baby is when you think you're going to lose your job or you've just lost your job. And you do see that effect at the micro level if you look at, say, individual level surveys, and you can see who's covered by different policies, and you do see some of that. So there is a lot of interesting work on that. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of communication, at least that I've seen, between the people looking at these what I would call individual level effects based on characteristics, and how that adds up and aggregates, and what drives these big trends. So that's kind of a missing piece of work. And for example, I mean, there's I didn't show the line. Let's go back to the first slide. Well, I won't go all the way back to the first slide, sorry. Okay, I wish I would have shown the slide which showed Latvia down here. All three of these countries were very hardly hit by the recession, but they act very differently. And to understand this, okay, it probably has to do with differences in policies and things like that. Okay? So I'm using unemployment here, but I want you not to get the wrong idea. I don't think it's unemployment that is causing these changes. I think it's changes in the economic climate and the psychology of everybody. So it's not just the 5% of people who go from having a job to not having a job whose behavior changes. Everybody's behavior changes a little bit. Okay? So part of what the fascination of demography is that individual actors do not cancel each other out. Somehow, everybody moves, or enough people move in the same direction that we see the whole population moving. So I was talking to Guy's wife, Simcha, about statistical mechanics yesterday, and populations are not like statistical mechanics. They don't kind of cancel each other out. They all move together somehow, and that's what we see in these times. Now, in the Great Depression, I would love to see an explanation that shows me the Great Depression did matter, but different groups canceled each other out. It's difficult, but I would love to see it. So good question. Let's see. I've had a couple questions from you, so I'll save a little bit. But please, yes.
Me?
Yes.
I've been always with these people who have like a bigger affinity towards like the cultural interpretation of fertility, but I would at least say the numbers you introduced, like they didn't do anything to refute it. But one aspect that maybe goes a little bit beyond your field of demography, but one impression I always had that economic terms are sometimes used to rationalize the decision not to have children.
Yes.
For example, if I speak to people in Germany, what I occasionally do is that like people say, we don't have children because like, it's so hard economically and this and that. But then you see at the same time that people who are actually like in different cultural background and surrounding, who are in a much tougher like economic situation, do have children anyway. So I think that there's an aspect of like economic factors being used to rationalize a decision or to rationalize.
So what was the real basis for these people who said they told you the story? What was the real reason? What you're saying, it wasn't that they were in hardship. Well, what is the real reason?
At the beginning, my impression, I have like a very strong affinity towards like the cultural interpretations of and explanations of fertility. But the question I actually wanted to ask you is whether there are like any studies that investigate how economic factors affect people that have like at a certain stage, at a certain age, like display like a clear moral orientation. It means like people who let's say at the age of 18 say like I want to have kids, and then like you watch like how they be in what kind of situations they get economically. how does it affect these people? Is there like within subgroups who like display a certain moral orientation, like an effect of economic factors? Is there any studies on that?
Well, I don't know. I don't know the use of the language moral orientation in this literature. I'm not familiar with having seen that. But I think the story that this age pattern that we're seeing in Spain today, for example, we can go back to that. I think it was here. Okay, why are these people? In fact, roughly what's happening is there's no change. The pattern has been that fertility is going up at older ages, and it continues to go up. Why are they not affected by the recession? Think of this as 0 here. Okay? And why are these people affected? And one explanation, maybe from moral orientation, might be these people are not so fixed in their ways. They're still open to changing their lives in different ways, and they know that any choice they make will not cut off things in the future. Whereas these people have lived longer. They have a more fixed compass of moral orientation, if you want to call it, or life goals, or scripts, if you want to use that. And also, there's the biological clock. They cannot put, postponing has a big cost for them. So if they want to have a child, now is the time to do it, whether it's good times or bad. So that may not answer your question so much. I think just in response to the question about your opening comment about there being two different families in equal economic situations, and one says times are too hard for me, and the other goes ahead and get it anyway, that isn't inconsistent with an economic explanation. People are certainly allowed to be different. They can have different thresholds, different tastes. So I don't think that just says, that refutes the argument that we are all the same. But that's not an assumption of economic thinking. It's just given the way we are, we're going to react in a certain way, I think would be a better way to paraphrase the economic thinking. Okay, let's see. We have a question from Barbara.
Thanks, Josh. It's always fun to hear a great demographer. I just wondering if you didn't mention too much about technological change, contraceptive revolution. I'm just wondering how you see that fitting into your story.
Well, it's a key to what happens, the changes from the 60s into the 70s and today, because now we have essentially zero cost ways of waiting to the perfect moment. So before, to wait for the perfect moment, it didn't cost you money, right? It had a big, the tax was in terms of your sexual behavior. You had to be very, very careful. And now with the pill, you don't need to be careful. So this is kind of enabled the stopping revolution in some sense. Now, I don't know if we have people, the starting revolution. Thanks, the starting revolution. Now, there is quite a bit of evidence that in former times there was also some spacing. People did, say, practice withdrawal or have less sex or do various things in the past when times were hard to change the spacing between their children. But that was not the main mechanism. That was, there are many studies that find a little bit of that. So there's the ability to do these things without technology, but technology makes it a lot easier. Now, the other issue is that probably, there was the invention of the contraceptive pill, but the widespread availability and introduction of this, and covering public insurance, all these things, was probably in response to demand built in the 60s. So it wasn't entirely kind of exogenous technological shock. The introduction and wide adoption of it showed that there was already this pent-up demand. In countries where the pill is not used much, like Japan, there's still enormous postponement, but people use other mechanisms. So under the contraceptive mechanisms, and also people delay partnerships and have sex, begin having a lot of sex at older ages. Having sex at older ages, a good note to end on. Okay. Let's see. Yes.
Just a technical question.
Yes.
I remember, and it's a memory, of a graph of number of births, not total fertility rates in the United States. And I remember that from 1930 onwards, there is a plateau in the number of births, not an absolute plateau, but the trend in number of births is not what you saw in the total fertility rates, which would indicate to me that there's a cohort effect that we're not seeing. In other words, the cohorts of people that you're looking at the time might be different. And I thought, how could that be? Well, between 1890 and 1915, a vast number of immigrants arrived in the United States. were quite different than the people who were there before.
Mm-hmm.
Could part of your blurring of differences be because of this big immigration wave, that immigration stopped in 1920 more or less, and these people would be reaching, or their children would be reaching average, the mean age of childbearing just then?
Okay, so I'll pick up on your language of wave to go back to the clumsy metaphor I used at the end, which was tides and winds. Okay, I think that this tide towards smaller families that's happening during the 20s and 30s, it's certainly driven by complicated compositional dynamics. Some groups already having small families, more and more groups moving towards having smaller families, and so that is a big part of the story, and maybe this relates to Josh's question a little bit, to tease that out and figure out which families are doing what, and is very interesting. And now the 20th century is open for historical demography, so we have it's now history, and we can study that. Another opportunity is that the 1940 census there's a 72-year limit. It's about to be released, so all the microdata is going to be released, and IPUMS, if you've ever heard of IPUMS, is digitizing all of it, and so we'll be able to look at who was in what families and the ages of the children, figure out exactly who had what children when by normal census characteristics. So it's a rich opportunity to, I've sketched out some broad strokes of what happened during the Great Depression, but we'll probably be able to find out a lot of the finer detail in the years ahead now that the data is being made available. On that note, I think I'm going to be silenced.
I want to thank Josh very much for the talk. Thank you very much.